Today's episode is focused on structural adjustment. And in fact, this is long overdue and is also very appropriately a return to our classic series, the Scam Hall of Fame. So, as a matter of fact, we're discussing structural adjustment today and trying to assess whether or not it deserves to be classed in the Scam Hall of Fame. So we're going to make an argument for why we think it deserves to be classed in the Scam Hall of Fame, and we'd be curious to hear from you as to whether you think, relative to the other scams we've covered, or to the ones we haven't covered, whether structural adjustment should be among that crowd. For us, and I mean, you might have already noticed this if you've been listening to our show, structural adjustment was a defining moment in recent Nigerian history. And I mean, it's certainly as significant as Nigeria's return to democracy, maybe even more so. And arguably, it might even be as significant as Nigerian independence from colonial rule. Let's see what the others think about that. But I say that to say it certainly is a turning point. And it's a turning point that's continued to shape daily reality in Nigeria and certainly public policy. And again, if you've been listening to the show to some extent, you're already probably familiar with terms like neoliberalism, which arises now and again in our conversation, and is a term that is sometimes used interchangeably with structural adjustment. So, these are the kinds of ideas we're going to dive into today, considering the history of adjustment, a bit of what it means, the practicalities, its legacy, and then why it is that we consider it to be, a very able, a very deserving member of the Hall of Fame. So, I mean, one thing to clarify is that this episode won't be a literature review. I mean, you know the show well enough to know that, we're not exactly doing that, but we will refer to some of the debates that have gone on, and there have been a lot of debates in trying to define what structural adjustment was, what it meant to achieve, the extent to which it was implemented, what its legacies have been, and other issues. So I think that's, worth stating outright that these are much contested areas. I mean, even within the left, there isn't per se a dominant definition or idea about what structural adjustment is or was. So, I mean, it goes without saying, what you'll be hearing today is our perspective, surely informed by other debates, but it's sort of, and in fact, it's our perspectives, because perspectives even in the room might differ for what structural adjustment was. Nonetheless, we will try to leave some links in the show notes, for readings that you can explore further if you want to dig deeper into various perspectives that have been out there and form one of your own. Also worth mentioning as my final preliminary statement is that we have an ongoing reading group discussion focused on structural adjustment. We happen to be most of the way through the season of the reading group, but if you're still interested in joining, or at least in seeing the reading list, then let us know. So with those caveats, I think we should dive in to Structural Adjustment Scam Hall of Fame. So the first question I think that requires grappling with, if we want to talk about structural adjustment, is what are structural adjustment programs? What are they meant to achieve? And I mean, we'll come back to now looking at them in the context of Nigeria's history, but I think it's worthwhile to just zoom out a bit and define SAPs, the other thing people call them. So How would you define SAPs? Maybe it's best we start there. OAG, do you want to take charge?
Yeah, these are just economic, I call it maybe tinkering, or I don't want to use the word adjustments again, but like some sort of bending to economic to achieve a certain or fixed economic goals or political economic goals, that most times are, has history shown to be dictated from outside. And it has to be with, the terms of where you're getting your money from, how you're getting it, and all the terms that come with the acquisition of, your money or your external funds, or with the thing you're looking to access or access, you know, outwards or inwards in your country. So these
Yeah.
adjustment programs, they can come in terms of, budget cuts, employment
Mm,
policies, in various industries in the country. There are certain twists and turns that you have to make as, the government of the day. So this structural adjustment, it has to do with changing the structure of the economy into maybe making
yeah.
it more liberal, reducing state control. There are a lot of
Mm,
features that come with this, but as we go in to the episode, we'll maybe dive into the specifics. But if you're getting money from outside parties or you're borrowing from International Monetary Fund or the World Bank and all that, you're required to do some certain things in your country. And these
mm,
adjustments and these changes in a broad term or sense can be termed what we'll call structural adjustment, just for the
word.
layman, definition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty straightforward, I
Yeah.
think.
Mm.
Um, Mega, anything to add there?
Well, I don't think that there's much to add. You know, as the name implies, is basically the liberalizing of a country's economy to suit the global order. So that there can be so that I mean, it's a way of realigning your economy to provide justification for why um, international capital should come in, even if on a short term basis. Usually, so always on a short term basis, but um, you need to guarantee that if things go south, the investor can't pull their funds. Something along those lines. I think.
No, and I think, yeah, that's important to also mention. And, maybe how I might phrase that is that it's a package of reforms that are implemented by countries as a way to make to make their economy more attractive to finance, more attractive to private investment, and often it's international private investment. So the package of reforms, I mean, as OJ and Emeka have said, often include um, diminishing the state's involvement in particular economic sectors or activities, and some of the standout state activities or sectors that are relinquished in these reforms include state management of the currency, like currency pegs. So where your government determines the exchange rate, that tends to be relinquished. That's one of the reforms that happens. Okay, so where you hear that the exchange rate is now floating, that's a post-reform situation. And then also the removal of subsidies on particular necessities like healthcare, housing, energy, fuel being one of the energy items, electricity, etc. And the liberalization of um, contracts between employer and worker, such that workers no longer get guarantees like they get to be in a union. Unions are part of their contracts. Workers can get short-term contracts, or employers can give workers short-term contracts. This is what the sort of policy that falls under a packet of labor deregulation policies. And there are a whole series of other forms of deregulation, but has that often come with that package. As has been stated earlier by OG and Emeka, um, the one objective of this package is again to make the country, in theory, more attractive for capital investment to flow in and certainly also flow out, because there shouldn't then be problems exchanging their currency or in some cases sacking their workers because those workers have shorter term contracts. They no longer have long term contracts, or those kinds of binders that would have made it harder for capitalism to be mobile. Yeah, I think that might be how I try to synthesize, what you guys have said. Is there anything we've missed, you think, that is essential to the definition? Just if we start at that level of definitions, or
Yeah, I think that the one other thing that needs to be said, from the onset is that the fallout or the implications usually of countries, the nature of the governments, of how they turn out, countries that adopt, these reforms, as you rightly put it, is that increasingly, almost automatically they become repressive, um, or they become at the very least manipulative. So I think I think that's important to
I mean, that's great to underline because I mean, like if you have somebody who's in the hospital the day before the reforms, and then the day after reforms, you have to pay their bill. That's already a repressive situation. And the hospital was free when they arrived, but now you have to pay a bill the day after. Like that's something's going to happen in that situation to make sure that the hospital gets that money. If you see, so it sets off a chain reaction that and that's if you were getting chicken for free at the cafeteria in a university, as some of our older comrades were. And then the next day you have to pay for chicken, you have to pay for housing in the university, you have to, so all these fees are introduced. So, I mean, I think people get the idea, but that's a really good point to point out. OG, any other thing to add?
I think it nicely summarizes, what we're
Okay.
trying to drive at. So yeah, we'll leave that. I'm
Right.
sure with our discussions, it'll become clearer where we're going to with this.
Fair enough. I mean,
Yeah.
so let's then dive into the history of SAPs in Nigeria specifically. And I mean, I suppose the best place to start is the beginning, right? But yeah, that's sometimes harder than it seems to pinpoint the exact beginning. But I'm gonna ask you guys to do that though, as hard as it might be. Um, Maybe coming to America this time to get us started. I mean, when would you date the start of SAPs? And maybe in talking through the start of SAPs, you can tell us a bit about why they seemed necessary at the time when they were introduced.
Oh boy, I work with this.
I mean, the summary version, right? We'll unpack it more, of course, but
I don't know. I think what the literature says is that, um, depending on who you're listening to or who you're reading, um, that it started in maybe 1985. So some say 1986. Okay, but if you're looking to stand in the middle somewhere, you can say that the idea was muted, and that debates were entertained early or sometime in mid 1985, even though Babangida will later on become, I mean, that's the effective military head of state at the time, will later become known as the evil genius because there are some who say that the outcome was already predetermined. So yeah, but in terms of the real deal, I think that 1986 would be the effective start date. Um, how did we get to that point? I mean, just before this, I think that's what I was trying to figure out. I don't know if I succeeded. You know, um, as much as I would have loved to. But I think that it's like you say, it's a difficult thing to say. I think the how did we get there part of the question. I mean, if you agree that these are the effective start dates for the program itself, but so there's some people who would say it's Shagari um, regime. Sorry, no, that's the Second Republic, right? Um, yeah, but I tend to 79. Yeah, but I tend to think that um, y- you'd even go all the way back to Gowon, and OBJ, in that military era. So sometime in the mid 70s, especially with the oil boom, which was what got Nigeria into the debt crisis. Immediately, there was a bust early in the 80s, and got us even into, I think, the recession. You know, um, yeah. So then Buhari came and tried to do exactly what he did this last time out, and some would say wasn't the situation, which then led to the coup, and Babangida's coming into power. And that you know there are even some leftists who concede that that it was necessary, but it was a matter of execution. Um, and they'll give you examples with where's pretty much, if you like, worked in parts of Latin America, I think, and maybe Asia. I mean, to cut to the chase, I think that yes, it's you can locate um, the why there was a need
Mm,
for it in the way that successive military governments and then the civilian administration that was in between military governments up until the time that it effectively started, to how they managed the economy and how they ran things aground. And then the literature says that they were statists, in their economic orientation. So there's a school of thought that you'd say and insist that those military governments, the good ones, the um, certainly what's his name now, the guy who was assassinated, Muritala,
yeah, Murtala Mohammed.
were statists, to an extent. But I think that maybe, but by the time you get to OBJ, he had started laying the groundwork for a liberalized or a liberalizing economy.
Right.
And then um, what Babangida eventually did was to, because while he had started it, the guys Shagari and his crew then accelerated it a bit. Buhari came and sought to slow it down, but not generally change course, which is usually what's how his administration is always narrative is always shaped. But Babangida came out and put his foot down. Yeah. That's what I'd say for that.
Yeah. No, fair enough. I mean, OG, any additions to the history? And then also, do you think the reforms were necessary? Or let's put it this way. Why do you think the reforms were seen as necessary?
Um, I just feel like it's really that's a cop out for
Mm,
these guys because if you're in power and the nature and the type of government that we've had is the one that's mismanaged the oil wealth, that's not done anything tangible with it, and then
yeah.
you're having a get out of jail free card anyway. It's not like the character of the government or the nature of the people running it has changed. So it's like, okay, yeah, this is giving us this is giving us one more chance to take the people for a ride again, so let's go for it. It's like a bailout. It's like how people go or governments go to bail themselves out, without having
Mm,
any really concrete plan to to transform their country, even if it comes with a little bit of inconvenience or that we have to all be austere or something like that. Just you know the nature of these people. So it's not like
Yeah.
the Gowon, Shagari, all of them, they've proven to squander all this money. And now you've put the people in a very tight corner. You are telling them that it is necessary. For them, it to be, of course, they're not the ones feeling the brunt of the implementation of these reforms. So they will say it's
Yeah.
necessary, You're the person that wants to feel the pain. They'll tell you it's necessary. But for them, it's like, yeah, this is just going to allow us to run the economy without money anyway. So we can just go and get we can get money from outside and then we'll squeeze the people harder as long as we can pay salaries and do the necessary cuts that are
Yeah.
social cuts and things that really are the lifeline of the people need. And, they don't care because they don't really base their lives on these things. So they will say it's necessary from the class aspect and
Mm.
class angle. They will say it's necessary. That's why they're saying it's necessary. But the people would push against it. And as we've seen and history has shown, is that, people, these governments become authoritarian, they start cracking down
Yep.
on people. And also, yeah, so from the class angle or class prison, the people that are looking to hammer you down will tell you it's necessary, and yeah, so that's why they're saying it's necessary to implement this. It's not like they're coming from a genuine standpoint and saying, look, if we do
Yeah.
this, this is how we're going to radically transform things. They're just parroting, cutting down jobs, cutting down. This is never it's never a good, tiding for people when you're saying you're cutting down jobs, services that they've had
Yeah.
before. It's never good, So that's what I think. I'm just going to approach it from the class angle, and that's my response
Right.
to that.
No, it's a fair point, and I will come back to the question of resistance naturally
Mm,
soon. In fact, probably the next question we should talk about. But I suppose what I would add in terms of the history of SAPs and the necessity of SAPs, maybe I can even answer both questions with one incident. I kind of feel like one of our last scam Hall of Fame incidents, both might be the starting point and what's then later on started to convince people that it was necessary. And that would be the Cement Armada scandal. I feel like the Armada scandal needs to be part of the history of SAPS because that's where, during the oil boom, as people know, the Gowon government ordered all this cement, partially as a policy to build out Nigerian infrastructure. And you can hear more about this in the episode where we discuss that. One of the long running outcomes of that episode is the fact that it really delegitimized public spending, right? It sort of set the tone where opponents of public spending could very easily have now a massive piece of evidence to suggest that public spending is inefficient, corrupt, etc. And I think that's not just true for Nigeria. It's probably because of the shock of the Cement Armada scandal to the global economy. I would assume that it was something that was referenced when critics of public spending, especially in resource-rich countries, wanted to point to what they thought was the problem with those kinds of economies. Um, of course, that didn't mean that the policies started to be implemented immediately. I would say that, yeah, one crucial moment after Semen Armada was then the events that triggered Ali Must Go. And this is where Emeka talks about Obasanjo starting the process of liberalization, right? So in 78, um, fees were introduced into the university system, right? And this is where students started to protest against the introduction of fees, and then the government clamped down. And the notion that you should pay fees for university, right? That came from somewhere. Previously, it wasn't really an idea that was dominant. And I think so that's worth pointing out when we talk about the history is that, yeah, these changes were occurring in Nigeria, policy changes, but they were also part of a global moment where there was a rising idea that the state should withdraw in spending should be minimized, and the budgets that followed the that moment in the 70s tended to be more austere. So Obasanjo withdrawing those the subsidization of universities was then followed by um, some recovery of spending in the Second Republic, but by the second election of the Second Republic, there was already all this talk about austerity. And as Emeka mentioned briefly, Buhari did cement this direction, this trajectory when he introduced like really lean budgets, cutting off spending in a number of areas. And then also, of course, brought in very sharply this element of repression. And when people resisted, the budget cuts, there was a kind of sharp clampdown. And I think all of this then set the context for Babangida in the 80s to introduce the first budget where the idea of structural adjustment, which is a package of reforms that included austerity, but also included like the withdrawal of the state, the selling off or privatization of previously state-run industries and enterprises, was formally announced as like the new policy direction of the government. So yeah, I mean, I think it was seen as necessary partially because like state spending was increasingly delegitimized locally and globally. I think OAG is right that there's an important class element, which is that elites who had previously been accumulating resources from corruption or from contracting with the state were increasingly seeing that they could also accumulate capital by buying and selling off state properties, and also by charging for the um, things that were previously the services that were previously provided by the state they could now actually get into those businesses and charge fees. So this is what we mean when you hear people say that structural adjustment inaugurated a new regime of accumulation, to use some of the grammar that OAG uses when we're not recording. So I mean, so I think those would probably be. And then the other thing to mention, perhaps, I mean, that hasn't come up yet, or at least not firmly in the conversation about why it was seen as necessary, was that, I mean, Emeka did mention it, but it was the fact that like during the oil boom, um, and especially when it crashed, Nigeria accumulated a lot of debt. In the international market, we got used to importing a lot of things because Nigeria's currency strengthened and Nigerian consumer demand increased. So, those Kingsway stores, those other kinds of forms of
UTC.
consumption, UTC, Nigerian people were buying stuff. And of course, Nigerian elites were buying stuff more than anything. I mean, Nigerian masses were buying the stuff was like what bicycles, but the elites and to some extent the middle class were buying much more, and of course this meant that those dollars held by the Nigerian government in its foreign accounts were being used to service those um, consumption needs, and some debt was being accrued in order to service those consumption needs. And of course some of the public services also required debt because the Nigerian government hadn't invested substantially in uh, deriving revenue from other sources outside of oil. So the fact that Nigeria was in debt then meant that international debtors could put pressure on the government, increasing pressure to sell things to them, basically to put their industries on the market, or to open up new areas of the market where the state had previously been dominant, so that capitalist interests could then compete in those areas. So that's a lot of jargon, but hopefully also clarifies or synthesizes some of the points that were made earlier. Anything to add in terms of just like the kind of history up until the reforms were announced, or the question of why they seemed necessary?
Let me chip this in real quick. And this is regarding why it seemed necessary. I think that I mean that it's important to also order some of the reasons why. Because OEG mentioned the corrupt nature of the elite of the ruling class.
Yeah.
While that's very valid, it pales in significance to what the already established structure of the world economy itself was. So that there was a structural part to how the world economy was ordered. And what African essentially military governments also tried to do, or even just governments in general tried to do sometime in the 70s. And this is me talking back to how you try to tease out part of why we got to that point of structural adjustment programs. So with the oil boom, so there's a part of the nature of industrial policies that nation states sought to pursue with the advent of high commodity prices and the oil boom, such that there was this adoption of that import substitution industrial policy, which,
Right.
which then put pressure on whatever it was that was the chief earner or commodity that was earning the highest for different nations.
Yeah, so you needed to like convert that oil money to like import substitution to trying to encourage like state enterprises or sometimes even local capitalist enterprises.
Yeah, and then you had to pay for machinery, you had to pay for all sorts of things, So that kind of also put a pressure on kind of added to how we then things got that's even what the lead up to how we incurred the kinds of debts that we then began to incur.
Right, that's a fair point. Not all the debt was consumption. Some of the debt was capital investment.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Yeah, that's worth saying. That as a matter of fact, some of the debt was productive debt, but then debt went out of fashion suddenly. At least for countries in the developing world. That's fair to say. I mean, so then, okay, let's talk through the actual policies that were implemented. Some people debate that actually Nigeria was not so serious. Babangida was not so serious at implementing SAPs, because like some subsidies were withdrawn, but not entirely. So for instance, the fuel subsidy survived SAPs. That's why we still talk about fuel subsidy today, even if it's now been mostly removed. And subsidization of some things, electricity still remained to some extent, and the currency liberalization was not complete. Rather than totally float the naira, a sort of second tier foreign exchange market was introduced. And we can get into what that means later on. But I think the point I'm trying to make is just that the perfect neoliberalism is not what was introduced right at the start. So some people would then say, actually, Nigeria has not really experienced SAPs per se, or we experienced like a watered down version. What do you folks think of that? Is that true, first of all? And then if you think so, why is that the case?
Well, before I say those guys, these people are high. Who are the people to start with? Because I mean, my opening statement, on this bit would be that there was no, you were never going to. It was a process. It was a program. And programs run for maybe even decades. But he started it out, and he really put down the structure. And I think in one of our recent episodes, I think the Babangida book thingy, we did, hint at the reason why she could raise 16 billion for a book launch, right?
Yeah.
And that's basically this guy saying thank you for, laying the groundwork for us to become, what we are today, by way of billionaires. So I don't think even that class of people will agree that he didn't, there were pushbacks, and it had to be, so that you couldn't get everything, all that whole chunk of programs in at one, in one fell swoop. You had to be staggered, and there was no telling from the onset which ones would, meet, some levels or serious levels of resistance. Yeah, so I don't buy that. Yeah.
How about you? How about you, OAG? I mean, I'm dying to hear your response. When people say like, Nigeria has not even really done adjustment, or like a Babangida didn't even. So, what's your take?
Yeah, just Google kill everybody now so that everybody will die. Because these people, it's not like they are dumb. They know that this thing is going to come with some sort of, blowback and pushback. So they look at the low-hanging fruits, the ones that they can do that is sort of, it won't kill you, but it'll hurt you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
they'll do
right.
the trade, the currency thing, the school fees thing. In fact, the school fees thing, I'm sure they wish they didn't do it as early, but
Yeah. Yeah.
because they got a lot of pushback from that, but they'll look at some
Yeah.
areas whereby it looks a bit abstract and you won't know the real terms until it starts, you know, kind of pinching you in the pocket, or things change and the face of your society starts changing, but on the
Mm.
abstract plane. So I'm sure they have advisors that will be like, okay, yeah, you want to do this, just do this, do that, small like that,
Yeah.
like incrementally, because if they say they want to do it in one fell swoop, they're going to kill everybody. People are just going to die, and you
They
see that
can't
the
do
ones and
Yeah.
you see that it's the ones that come and do it in that drastic measure, that'll get really, really bad pushbacks, except if you've beaten
Yeah.
people to a point where it's so weak, and then you can come up with the other ones that are more direct that we're having in later terms, like all this Jonathan, Tinubu, Jonathan, and then Obasanjo Part 2,
Yeah.
Tinubu, and all that, So, but they've done, like Emeka rightly said, it's a decades. They've been
Yeah.
doing it. They are just removing it small, small, drip, 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 until when they
Yeah.
do something that's drastic, it just feels like it's our normal life. Anyway, we've been down. He that is down needs fear no fall. Anyway, so remove the subsidy. So that's why motherfuckers like this guy can come and say subsidy is gone, boom, bam, that's that. Because they've beaten us to that point for decades.
Yeah.
And
No,
then
but hang on. I mean, let me complicate this a little bit. So, but there is a perspective in Nigeria that says that it's very tough to do business in Nigeria. That Nigeria is full of red tape and regulation. I mean, of course, the one laughable version of that is where people say Nigeria is a socialist country. I mean, we can set that aside because that will not, the listener will know that that's not the case. But I mean, that's the extreme version. But the more common version is where people say, it's so it's not liberal. There's no space for business. Businesses struggle. I mean, why is that the case? If there's been structural adjustment, if the adjustment has been thorough enough, or in fact, if the adjustment was as significant as people on the left say it is, then why is it that it's still hard to do business in Nigeria? Thoughts?
I just
don't
feel
don't
like
And I should say the state is everywhere. Like there's this you have to go to this office, that office to get this stamp, that stamp. The person is not on seat.
yeah, yeah.
There's like people taxing you on the street. So it seems like we have an abundance of bureaucracy in Nigeria, and the state still has its hand in so many pies. So I
Yeah.
mean, from that point of view, there needs to be even more adjustment, right?
No,
So
no,
how
no,
would you
no.
respond to those people?
No, 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 no. I fear that I might contradict myself, but let's see how it goes. I hear people say that. So let me say that real quick, right? But I also hear those people say that, in diagnosing, why that there's the incapability or the incapacity of the civil service to rise up to the occasion of I don't want to say bureaucracy, but to make things easy or easier. Okay. So that there's over time that the civil service has been bastardized. Um, People will give you all sorts of reasons, especially ethnic ones, and in the course of time, this has affected their capacity to deliver or to be able to shepherd, the process of running government. Okay, so that's one part of why they say that.
The adjustment was incompetent.
Well, I mean, it wasn't particularly done by competent civil servants. I mean, I think we had moved past the days of the super palm sec.
But I think that's worth dwelling upon for a moment. So you're saying that, like, in a sense, because of some of the austerity that preceded the adjustment, like the fact that the fact that the fact that Murtala Mohammed sacked a lot of senior
There was a
level civil
purge.
servants.
Yeah, there was a purge,
Right. And the fact that the civil service was purged then meant that the adjustment, the reforms, the like states did not have the capacity to actually implement things effectively. So you know, is that what you're saying? So then the reforms have not really been implemented, or they were only partially implemented. You know, so what's the outcome of that? Would you say? I mean, that's if
I
you buy
mean,
that. You know, if that's the
so,
direction you
so,
were going.
so to follow through with that bit, I think that there's an argument for saying that you know that these things were poorly implemented. Because it's one thing to put stuff down on paper, it's another thing to implement it. So that's where I'll stop with that. The second thing I was going to say, as part of why people say that business is hard or difficult, ease of doing business is crazy in Nigeria, is that there's also the argument, for the infrastructural deficit. The kinds of public goods that enhance,
So the state had not even invested enough before withdrawing.
I'm just telling you what they say, my brother. I'm not.
Okay. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever they mean, that's not what they say.
But however you one then decides to tie all these ends together, to make or from their own opinion is left. But these are some of the things that are being said, for ease of doing business. I don't know how to tie it up, or I'm not trying to tie it up to the implementation of structural adjustment, or why it was necessary. But I think that there's a bit of why it was necessary. The argument for it that I buy, how it then was executed is a totally different ball game. I mean, and you can see it even in the present, time, because I almost think that why this conversation is important is because we're going through it again. We're experiencing same,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, OG, your thoughts? I mean, why is
Yeah.
business not? Or do you think business is easier than it seems? People are just lying, or what? I mean, what?
I feel like there are some things that we need to examine, especially the nature of the civil service, and its real character. As someone with some sort of history with the civil service, I feel the nature of the Nigerian civil service is one that stands in the way of things in terms of, being middlemen. This is what we want to do. Okay, you must pass through us to achieve this. You must pass through us to achieve this. They're more of gatekeepers. So
Right.
in a society that's really not 100% about productivities, the work of the gatekeeper becomes more accentuated. It becomes more magnified, whereby it's just like, okay, yeah, I'm just standing and getting my, court, or I'm talking about the people that work in the civil service now. And then
Yeah.
whatever you want to do, be it coming from the come as private individuals or state execution, is so much about getting your own, staying in the way and getting your own court, and then moving things along. It's about moving things
Yeah.
along, not productivity. You get what I'm saying?
Right.
It's not
Yeah.
productivity. It's about moving things along. Let's just move this file, pass this file. So it's not about productivity or having
Yeah.
KPIs or things, metrics that you
Well,
can measure progress with.
okay. Yeah,
That's
right.
why when you come with something then to achieve that has some sort of KPIs, it doesn't transform into actuality.
Yeah.
You can't
Yeah.
have that materialization of it. Because I feel
Mm.
is something that's haunted the civil service ever since.
Right.
And what's the second question about?
Based on that, the folks who argue that SAPs were not implemented enough or sufficiently, then don't they have a point? Because, from in the ideal world, like SAPs would have retrenched all those civil servants, and then the number of people you have to meet, rather than 3 steps, it would just be 1 step, and then the ease of doing business would be much more. Because of course that's another thing that SAPs was doing that we didn't mention, is that it was also literally slimming down the state, or was supposed to be slimming down the state. So I mean, based on that, then would you say that they have a point, or how would you address that? that
No,
critique of, yeah, okay.
no, no.
Okay.
I feel like what capitalism will be or what it is in developed countries and all, it's going to be
Mm,
different from what it's going to be in a neo-colonial society where the level of development, historical development is different. So if you're bringing some sort of ideal process, structural adjustment thing or economic model and coming to graft
yeah.
it into a place where we have severe deficit in terms of infrastructure, a lot of things where the society cannot stand by itself, it's going to crumble and fail and then give you outcomes that you probably hadn't foreseen when you were doing your
Yeah.
mathematics in Harvard or whatever bullshit
Mm.
institution you were. So I feel like where we are or where we were and where we
Yeah.
still are ourselves currently in this our country, anything you want to implement that doesn't factor where we are, historically, social standing, it's going to become a huge problem. And that's why those
Mm.
things don't graft in properly. So when we
Yeah.
copy things, we don't factor what we have on ground, and then you come and implement these things that professors have come with, and then it fails because you're missing the social aspect. You're
Yeah.
missing a lot of aspects that are hidden from your pie charts, from your bar charts, and all that. So when you implement it, and then you start seeing that, oh, so we did this, and then it's downstream, it's causing problem in this thing, and this is
Yeah.
nullifying the effect of it. Okay, yeah, some people can come, you've done the interest rate, you've increased this, you've done that. It might look good on paper for
Yeah.
some people, but for the majority of the country, it just brings bad tidings. And then,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that's why I feel like there are two angles to looking at it, whereby, some will say, yeah, they liberalized this, they did this is what, but again,
Mm.
the side effects of it on ground really kind of
Right.
cancel out, what you hope to get.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's fair. I hear you saying that the SAP reforms, right? You know, part of why we don't have the perfect environment for business, quote unquote, is that the SAP reforms did not actually factor in the reality on ground, including some of the previous SAP adjacent reforms. Like Emeka has said, the fact that the civil service was already shredded meant like, who were you? Who did you expect to be implementing the reforms?
Ghosts.
You know, so so that's a fair point. I think the other is that why that perspective still remains is that to some extent, there were some reversals, in the implementation that meant that the implementation sometimes went forward and then would take like 5 steps forward and then 2 steps back. So it didn't always go. And I mean, the classic, this is most evident, or became most evident when Abacha took power. And it's part of the reason why some people still say, oh, Abacha was a good president. I mean, I don't know if you guys hear this sometimes, but once in a while, we were like, oh, Abacha was, because, Abacha withdrew or suspended some elements of the reform program. He left others to run, right? But like, he slowed down some of the um, uh, currency liberalization efforts. He initially put a break, if I understand the history correctly, on um, removing fuel subsidies, and then tried to do it again towards the end of his tenure. Um, and then he also introduced tariffs, reintroduced tariffs on certain items. So put up more of a trade barrier. And so that, of course, allowed certain Nigerian industries that require tariffs to operate to be shielded a little bit by the state. So, and of course, some of those Abacha, um, what would you call them, like statist policies, were then reversed again when you get the Obasanjo period and the Goodluck period. So, when people say there has been policy inconsistency, I suppose that they might have some point, right? In the sense that, at the top level of government, all the reforms haven't always been operating at the same time. Some have kind of gone forward and back, while others have remained in operation. And then, of course, I think the other thing to mention is that, yes, all of this, despite all of this being true, there are still people who started making money at the start of the reforms and continue making money to the present day because they could bypass the failing bureaucracy. Like, OEG,
Yeah,
your days back in the bureaucracy, you know that there are
definitely.
certain files. that you don't shift those files around. The files go
Nah,
straight to the
it's
director's office.
straight.
Yeah,
Those are the ones that, yeah,
right.
when we say business, they have the ease of doing business. It might be hard for you, but
So
it flows well.
exactly.
This,
So that's the other factor that, people tend to forget or pretend like to unlook when they talk about ease of doing business is that the reforms made it easy for certain classes of people, much easier than it had been before. And those are the people who benefited from the initial sales of privatization. Those are the people who knew or saw the reforms coming and positioned themselves in certain sectors that they could then take over, where the state had previously been operating and create monopolies. So I think that in a sense, the reforms did succeed and have continued to succeed for those people. But in a sense, who's to say that they were designed for you, your mom and pop factory or your small
businesses, yeah.
business or your crypto
Uh,
wallet? I mean,
your soap
presuming that,
making.
right. Exactly.
Mm.
So you could say that that's one of the fallacies that was introduced is that, oh, because this is supposed to be liberalization, then it will benefit every business person equally. But, again, who's to say that that would be the case in a post-colonial economy or in any economy? So that's what I might add to that.
If you look at the character of
Yeah.
capitalism anyway, it helps or promotes concentration of capital, and it's only
Right.
going to work for people at the top or spur up new billionaires that will concentrate wealth. So at some point too, that's where we're going to be headed with, like amassing of wealth with all these guys that are now pockets of
Yeah.
millionaires and billionaires that are
Yeah.
controlling, the country. That's what can lay the foundation for them. That's why they could
Yeah.
give 16
Right.
billion out during the book launch.
Yeah, as we explored in the Babangida episode, which I make a reference. I
Mm.
mean, so okay, to try to bring it home, I suppose one question that we haven't addressed head on is the question of resistance to SAPs. Of course, it's come up, but I'm curious as to what you folks think about the resistance. So we've talked about anti-SAP protests, we talked about Ali Must Go in reference to the uh, withdrawal of fee, the introduction of fees in universities. And in all of these moments, what we're referring to is protest movements that emerged on campus, that also emerged in the streets. When the issue, especially when the issue touched on the labor movement, yes, the sacking of workers or the introduction of like these contracts, unfavorable contracts, labor deregulation, there was pushback, right? But arguably, the pushback was ineffective ultimately. So why is that? I mean, so would you agree that
Yeah.
the pushback has been ineffective and or was ineffective? And if so, I mean, could you historicize that a bit for us? Like why is that? Why, what happened that the pushback became, or wasn't successful at completely stalling the reforms or pushing them in a totally different direction?
Yeah,
Firstly.
I feel like organizations that we had really at that point, everyone that came out, from the students to some unions that came out, really, you just don't, maybe with pushing back, you just try your best. And if you
Mm,
don't have anything to maybe sustain it and carry it out or onto maybe political alternative or sort of,
mm.
you know, permanent, make your actions permanent, at some point it's going to spin itself out, especially
Right.
with, let's not forget the military component. I'm just going to be fronting and saying that, going against the military, blah, blah, they should have just been out there. No, it's the military. They'll have guns, they have all this. So how history plays out with, confronting guns or, people that are armed with state power is very, very tricky. And if
Yeah.
you don't have a matching force, maybe like a militia that really would rise up to the occasion that is also armed, it's very hard for you to win with your hands up and against someone that has like machine guns or, armored personnel carriers. So
Mhm.
the people just did what they could at that point in time. But the
Mhm.
learnings and the actions that are supposed to be taken is that, metamorphosing this thing into political action and making
Yeah.
it permanent and educating people and most importantly not falling victim of this their propaganda and lies again because at this moment what we have is the same structural adjustments coming in and then we now have the argument of oh this is how we'll have implemented it, this is how we'll have done it, oh they didn't do it well, Tinubu didn't do it well, if I come in as Atiku I'll have done it this way, if I came in as Obi I'll have done it that way. So we're back to the
Yeah.
same thing, and there's been no significant political maturity. That's where my own problem is to carry on our, varying or divergent views into political action that will have
Yeah.
been, yeah. So that's where, I'm at with that.
Okay. Fair enough. I mean, Omeka rather, sorry. What do you think about Oji's take there? That like, in a sense, had the popular movement, the left, been able to match the state in arms for one, and in political organization more generally, we would have seen a different trajectory emerge. I mean, do you think the ineffectiveness could boil down, in a sense, to different balance of firepower?
Um, I'm not the person who's going to say that the pushback of the resistance was ineffective. Yeah, but I think that it did its bit. I mean, whatever resistance was put up in that period that we're talking about. Um, and this is effectively in the 19 in the later parts of the 80s. Okay, and I think that what can be said, or two things that can be said, was that the resistance took a while to grow and push back. Yeah. And didn't do so effectively until 1989. Um, my knowledge of the SAP riot itself isn't as solid as I'd love it to be, but I do know that there was a pushback in the 80s, so that by 1990 and 91, Babangida had begun to even roll back. This is even prior to the Abacha days on some of those things. So I mean, if you got the government, the military government of the day, to roll back some of its policies, I think that it would be unfair to say that or that the resistance didn't quite achieve much. It did. So I think that where the problem has been is especially from the left point of view, is how have we managed to sustain that resistance such that we probably shouldn't have been or shouldn't be where we are today, replicating some um, aspects of that era. The idea that the resistance wasn't quite sustained is the one that maybe I buy into, because because otherwise, how would you explain that we are where we are today? And yeah, so that's how I see it. Now, it's just so that I go back a little bit. I also think that the ways in which there was push and shove between what the government tried to do, um, what it was able to achieve, how it was able to achieve, push these policies up to the 1980s, late 80s, with the help of the political bureau, um, what the split in the political bureau then cost it, by the late 80s, and so that push and tug and pull, then gave us what history can ascertain to and the kinds of billionaires that it produced. Okay, and how that then affected the psyche of the generations or that have come after, which in turn plays a role in why resistance seems not to be strong. Is that psychologically what the fallout of SAP, maybe even more than the Civil War, is one that has brought us to a point where the average Nigerian is inclined to the liberalizing worldview, the worldview of liberalizing.
Right. The propaganda of SAP.
Yeah, of liberalization. So you then find that over time you don't you get a critical mass of people who think or who think differently, even though that the mass of the people don't know any different. But you still have a much more significant mass that buy into the ideologies of a liberalizing economy. You know, so that where we are now is that it's easy to say that the resistance kind of failed, and it did it in a certain regard, because it couldn't sustain itself, and all of that, and that's where you would want to heap the blame on what it was that became of the Nigerian left, but it was also in that time, as a consequence of all of this, that the left even began to have a problem, because there was also the problem of, again, sustenance, but this time from the point of view of comrades, and their livelihood. So you then had where, as a result of SAP policies, you had what you call the NGOization of, but it's also linked to that psyche, the way the psyche operates. So that today, the average Nigerian wants to be the next Dangote. I don't know why, if I can say this enough, and so you're talking to a brick wall when you start to talk about how previous industrial policies were maybe not even fashioned to benefit these guys, but because of the shoddy way in which it was implemented, these guys then grew to become very large behemoths, which and are doing basically volumes, volumes enough for that it has become almost impossible for governments to ignore them, in economic planning. So I guess that's my view, and that's how I see the issue of the kind of resistance that we've been able to.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's fair. And you make a good side point there when you say that actually a lot of these behemoths were created in the era of import substitution. So actually, it's a lot of like the monopoly capital in Nigeria at the moment. Some of it had actually been established even before structural adjustment, so they had their first mover advantage. But that's a side point. I think what both of you and OG have said is there was some limitation in. Okay, we have to give the resistance some credit because they did force the regimes to modify elements of the policy program and slow things down. So subsidy removal wasn't immediate, for instance, and a lot of things all had to be reversed. And of course, it's even part of that pressure that Abacha was responding to in a populist manner when he arrived. But I think and the other point you're making is that that the pressure couldn't be sustained for various reasons, and some of those reasons are internal to the left. And I think we have to also, of course, make reference to some of the external reasons, like reasons that were imposed upon the left, which we've talked about a little before, that they were repressed. They lost their jobs in the universities, they were sacked by their employers, or their unions were crushed, they were jailed. And importantly, I think this really is worth saying to add to why the resistance, didn't ultimately achieve its aims, is that the regime backtracked on the political liberalization project. That political liberalization, or in other words, the reintroduction of elections and political parties.
Wasn't that always supposed to be a distraction?
Well, so that's the question. And this is the question of IBB, the defining question perhaps of the IBB period, is that did he ever intend for there to be democracy? Or was the whole democracy project culminating in the election and that produced junta? Was that whole project just a distraction from the economic reforms? I mean, some people say that it was a way to split the resistance so that some of them were focusing on elections and the other were focusing on resisting the economic reform. And of course, you can see that play out even today. That some people are like, no, don't oppose Tinubu. Let's already start preparing for elections. Do you know what I mean? So that's a classic problem in democracy, is that you have to both think about opposing today and planning for the next election if you're in the resistance, if you're in the ideological resistance. But that they were doing all of that in the late 80s and early 90s. The resistance was doing all of this, organizing parties, doing party meetings, still doing protests, and then culminating towards an election where, yes, there were all sorts of shenanigans. The left parties were deregistered, and the left that continued to be electorally active had to all line up behind SDP, mostly line up behind SDP. And then, even still, given that SDP was dominated by the Social Democratic Party, one of the two remaining parties that were allowed to run in the election, were dominated by the centrists, so the center right, that was okay with the reforms. The elections were still annulled. So it would have meant that even if the left could have had some opportunity to put pressure on Abiola as president because they kind of controlled some of the party structures, that option was foreclosed when the elections were annulled and a new authoritarian regime took power. So I guess it's another way to just expand on the question of repression. But it's to say that, the associational space remained quite closed, and the opportunities to actually resist at the ballot box, in the local levels, in parliament, these things were not available. So, and maybe this goes then ultimately back to the second point OG made, is that perhaps if a new both economic and political vision was available for the resistance, a vision that might have included, like arming themselves. We can disagree about that, but certainly a vision that wasn't anchored to the existing political regimes, then maybe we could have seen a different kind of resistance emerge. I don't know if there's more to add on that point about resistance.
I think that's it, really. Because the factors or the things that we have to work with really matter a lot. And then, it's also where the people are, the availability of organizations, political maturity, a lot of things come into play. And then, the nature of the enemy we're fighting, at times it morphs into democratic, in quotes, and then it's military, and what it does to the psyche of the people too matters a lot, because people just get bombarded with a lot of propaganda and they think that, they are doing something, whereas we're just turning the wheel round and round again.
Right.
So, yeah.
Someone once said men and women make history, although not under conditions of their choosing. I think it was Pastor E.A. Adeboye that said that, actually.
I think there's an original, but I don't remember. I don't know if this is my parting shot, but I'd like to preempt, if you have a next question. And so the way I figure out resistance in relation to the overarching question, that we're trying to figure out in this episode, whether SAP was a scam. I think that if my answer were yes to that question, there are ways in which you can think of it as a scam. It will.
Yeah, I mean, that is the next question I was going to ask, and the final question. So yeah, well done. No, but yes, it's like, well, SAP's a scam, and then also, since you're answering it, you might also throw in, like, how do you feel the SAPs measure up to the other scams that we have previously discussed? Or the other scams you think we should would you say it's the defining scam, or
No, let me answer that because I might forget. So, in my estimation, I think that it would rank up there with the scam of national liberation? What's that?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
it's in terms of how integral it is to how society thinks of itself. But yeah, so
Yeah.
the
Mm.
scam to me would be that what SAP had managed to achieve, when push comes to shove, when you take it holistically, is that we then have managed to get uh, self-professed Democrats or progressive
Mm.
who claim to have caught their feet, during that period, because of course it then culminated in the June 12th thing and and
Right.
and the struggle. So yeah, I think that if we date the start period as 1986, we would say that the culmination of all of that was somewhere in 1993, 1994, and that the guys um, who owned the narrative of being freedom fighters and this and that, especially because of the level of repression that you need to enforce that kind of program, to actually
Yeah.
restructure the economy of the country.
Right.
Is that those guys are now the beneficiaries, or have now become the beneficiaries, and no, maybe not beneficiaries, but the recipients of
Uh,
power, of power
right. The Fourth
today
Republic.
in the Fourth Republic. And as we're finding out, all along, I think that it's clear to us that they for a long time now they've been bullshitters.
Mm.
Um, so if there's a sense in which um, I've considered the whole SAP episode a scam, it's that the guys who um, seem to have been critiques of the Babangidas and the IB and the Abachas of yesteryears have shown that
Mm.
they're no different from the people who they had often criticized. So
Yeah.
that's uh, that's what I think. It's the scam, the nature of the scam that's embedded in that era.
That's a good point. That the harshness of the implementation, especially the kind of removal of, or the sort of the obstacle it placed in the path of political liberalization, created these fake heroes.
Hmm.
People who became the champions of democracy, as they call them. So somebody like Tinubu would say he fought for democracy now as a result of the. But you could also say that that's where a lot of the NGO sector comes from,
Hmm.
right? But you could say that that moment also produced the NGO sector, right? Because the fight for human rights, um, the civil liberties of the people who had been jailed by the regime, that struggle as well emerged from, yeah, the repression that was generated to reinforce or protect the austerity regime and the SAP regime. So yeah, that's a good point. That one legacy is the fake heroes, within government and in some cases within the quote unquote civil society.
Oh yes.
OG, how about you? SAP as a scam. I mean, yeah. How do you think it ranks relative to other scams? Do you agree with America that that it is as almost as essential as the scam of the nation state itself? Or I mean, or do you think there's some other scams that
Yeah,
might compete, and why?
in 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 Nigerian political history, it is proven to become one of the stronger scams. Of course,
Yeah.
the national liberation and national struggle, of course, ranks as one of the top, in fact, if not the highest one, because that's what this our podcast is based on. But
Yeah.
as Nigerian history progresses and we've gone to, in quote, democratic dispensation, we're seeing that there's a thread of that sap that's now birthed all these, political actors that are now scammers that are
Mm.
enshrining the underdevelopment of the country. So it's one of the major scams that we've had. And then you have to
Yeah.
look at all the players in that, from that time up until now, and the role that they played back then and the role
Yeah.
that they are playing now, and then you see that, they're just furthering, the stagnation of the country, So it's one of the major scams that
Yeah.
people should look at, and look out for. So that when there's a new
Mm.
electoral cycle and these people come and mouth the same thing, you can remember this episode and see that these players are just the same thing. And then when it comes to the substance and the things that they are made up of, they are not in any way different from the guys that are, that have ruined the country before, So just
Right.
be on the
Right.
lookout for them. Yeah.
No, fair enough. I mean, I think I also maybe emphasize that last point you made, that like, and okay, maybe also a second point, but the first would be that, yeah, the impoverishment that has resulted from the structural adjustment has been, devastating and tragic, and that's what makes it such a terrible scam, is that people are now, people whose parents had better life prospects have now been pushed back into poverty, right? Like like with all its problems, the import substitution period, at least the quality of social services did see some social mobility introduced in society, right? And a job meant something, and a job was possible. A university degree meant something, and a degree was possible. But the shattering of all of those promises then made independence even more useless than it was in the past, if you could say that. In fact, some people go as far as saying that structural adjustment reversed independence, because
Mm.
in a sense, we have become a much more dependent country on the price of oil, on begging for investment, right? Begging really for foreigners to come and run the economy again, or contribute much more to the economy again in a lot of cases. And even if not foreigners, then individuals with immense capital that answer to nobody but themselves and their shareholders. So yeah, that impoverishment and like, yeah, the shrinking of political possibility that accompanied SAPs, I think, make it certainly one of the most significant scams. I mean, it probably then surpasses. Yeah, I think I probably agree with Emeka then that, right, leaving aside the Civil War, which we have to come back to, um, it would probably be up there, yeah, right under national liberation itself. But okay, but that would have been the ideal place to conclude, except I want to throw a bonus question in here um, to make life very difficult for both of you.
Mm.
And the question is there anything good that came out of SAPS? Can you think of one maybe, or were there any positives from a left point of view, from point of view of like human social liberation? I don't mean from the point of view of policy wonks. I mean, is there anything good about SAPS ultimately at the end of the day?
I think if we pick learnings from it, then it will manifest into something being good in the future. I don't know.
Dialectic,
Yeah,
comrade. Yeah.
but nah, I don't know. Because if you ask people that their lives have been damaged and destroyed for this thing, I don't think they will look at it
Yeah.
up to you when you start trying to wiggle out some sort of good thing. That good thing that came out from it. But I don't know. Like
Right.
what came to me directly when you asked that question was that I just said that maybe in the future if
Right.
we pick our learnings from it and then know how to move and how to position ourselves, how to resist, how to do political organizations, then we can say we've picked a learning from it, and then this is the good thing that came out of it. So, but for
Right.
now, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, fair enough. Yeah. So, okay, may I get your thoughts?
My
Liberalization,
thought.
let's say. Yeah. I mean, positives. Is there anything we can defend?
Not off the top of my head, except
Yeah. Yeah.
since you're fixing a bonus question, you incentivize
Bonus.
everyone else.
Yeah, my incentive for you is that if you start a CNG business, then you can now you get more out of it than
My
if the
CNG,
government dominated.
CNG
If the
don't
government
die.
dom Yeah. I mean, I suppose I would say that, look, we talked about some positives, even if mixed in a mixed way. When we talked about the marketing boards, that some elements of state-run enterprise under this particular conditions of post-colonial capitalism that we were running were actually very terrible. I mean, like, yeah, they might have accrued some resources to the state and the elites, but they were predatory. And so the fact that SAPs got rid of marketing boards, honestly, it's something that yeah, I mean, that it came with all this other bullshit is terrible. But that it created some space um for the peasantry, for instance, farmers in particular to have a bit more control over their um sales vis-a-vis the state. I suppose that's a minor benefit. Of course, as we said in that episode, to some extent, marketing boards have been replaced by these export companies that still come and buy cheaply from farmers. So it's not like it then set them free, or something. But um, you know, yeah, that your own country was what was exploiting you in such a direct way, perhaps is a little worse than for it to be a company. I don't even know if that's the case. Okay, so maybe I'm not as confident that is a positive um, of structural adjustment. So yes, I suppose it would be very hard for us to find a positive, and maybe that's why it belongs as high as it does on the list of the scam Hall of Fame.
Yeah, especially, in the psychological aspect, on the psychological aspect, what it has then done to people, so
Yeah,
it remains like a self-perpetuating mirage
yeah,
where you feel like, yeah, this thing, no, if it was done properly, then it could have led us to this, and it just
yeah,
keeps perpetuating itself, So yeah, in that regard, it's one of the major scams when it comes to also the mental level of the people and the kind
yeah,
of damage it has done.
yeah. Okay, my final bonus question, since you guys didn't really bite that one, would be um, hypothetically, if we got a more competent neoliberal as president, somebody who could implement SAP more effectively, who could be more gentle with repression, if you can manage that, or at least if you can imagine that, or at least manage the way in which it's be better at propaganda, so people were uh, able to believe that, okay, let's give this time rather than come out to the streets. Um, is there a way in which that would be better than the incompetent version that we've sometimes gotten? So, what is preferable for the left? A competent neoliberalism or an incompetent one? So that's my final question before we wrap up, you guys.
Okay. I don't know if this answers your question. Um, but I think it probably does answer the question before this one, the bonus before this one. I think that maybe what SAP actually has done, and I might be wrong, don't quote me, is that it's in more ways than one has given birth to this, um, especially in the neoliberal, for believers or proponents of neoliberalism, it's giving birth to
Yeah.
this sense of identity in the entrepreneurial world, where you have
Okay.
this push, this drive for indigenous companies. I mean, essentially
Okay.
the same way as say, uh, maybe not the same way, but yeah. So there's this sense that uh, there's a need for companies to be more indigenous, and play in that space and then become exporters of some sort, yeah. So because one component of SAP, even in the 80s, was to drive exports, which it didn't quite
Right.
deliver. So um, there are chances this time round that it's beginning to, even if the examples are few and far. between. So I guess
Well,
that yeah, you can.
yeah. No, that's a really good point. I mean, and it's kind of one of the things I was trying to say about the rural economy and farmers,
Mm,
but I didn't
mm,
say it as clearly because I got stuck with the marketing board. But it's, yeah, you're right that like one of the rationales of cheapening the currency is that, I mean, of devaluing currency is that it cheapens exports. So
exports,
it
yeah.
means that, yeah, if you take your cow to Niger, you can sell it for probably twice or three times the price in Naira that you could sell it
Mm,
if you sell it in Sokoto. Um, but yeah, I mean, the problem is that the cost of living is still very high. But yeah, I mean, so some produce, certain classes of produce will now sell better, especially for farmers, especially agricultural produce, um, than they would before the reforms. So yeah,
yeah.
I mean,
Mm,
if we don't put it
and
back into the context of this kind of society you're living in to produce those goods, then on its own, you could say that that's a benefit. I'd buy that.
yeah, and I think that what a more confident uh, neoliberalist, as president, perhaps might achieve is unlocking, the potentials in some of these sectors. Say maybe even agriculture, for instance. Uh, yes, and encouraging people to go into those forms of employment.
Mm,
So yeah, so there's a sense in which yeah you can get that if the person then is people oriented. Because one of the drawbacks of this um, system is that he, he, he only deals in volumes. So now
right.
billionaire will get volumes now in the states they listen to. But and that's especially and that's mostly because they don't even have the capacity to do the work to aggregate the smallholder, say farmers, for example, who if you bring together will do more volumes or almost as much volumes as
Yeah, but of course they try to do that before the marketing boards. So, I mean,
hmm,
like I said, I don't think that worked so well.
hmm.
Yeah.
No, I
No, but
mean,
fair
there's a way.
point. Yeah,
Hmm. I don't know whether they need to do it with the marketing boards this time around, or whether the person has to. But that's just my
fair point. OG, you want to take a stab? Any final thoughts on the question? Like, yeah, is this version of the one we're getting better or worse for popular movements in theory if we had a more competent implementer of neoliberalism?
I feel like there might be when you say more competent implementer or something, we need to break we need to break that down, but however, I feel like if you're getting some money to then change the face of the country, if you're someone that's really up for national development and progress, there's an opportunity for you to stimulate some sectors whereby it might be a bit tough, but we'll come out stronger for it. So I feel there's that opportunity in there because inside of all these things now, I feel like anyone that has the insight and political understanding and real understanding of the country, its natural resources, its people, the human resources, you're going to be able to wriggle your way out into achieving something whereby if you look what you traded, it might sort of the benefits if you do it and you're true to some things that come like from the perspective of the people whereby you carry them along into like making sure that they get the best out of the deals you got, it might then help to stimulate some sectors, and then we can have some trade-offs whereby the
Yeah.
stronger your country is, the stronger people's orientation. You're not making them shy to participate politically, repressing them. It might sort of improve the democracy whereby we can then win back some of the things that were traded off, or maybe when these deals expire and then you want to renew them, whatever, you just cut off and say like, look, we don't need you guys again. For the moment where we were weak, for the moment where we needed this money critically, we're able to use it to stimulate these sectors, and then we are free of these things. We
Yeah.
can do our things ourselves. So There's always an
Right.
opportunity there, but it's hard because of what we're starting from, the crop of leadership we have, the people, so it's a
Yeah.
lot of things. Yeah. So let me just put it that way.
Right.
Mm.
No, fair enough. I mean, I think the question you've answered is a more interesting question anyway, which is where to from here? I mean, how would we get out of this with more competent leadership? And that's not competent neoliberal leadership, actually, as much as like a more pro people, because of course
Yeah.
those two things rarely come together. A pro
Yeah.
people neoliberal is as easy to imagine
Stuff.
as, I don't know, a flying pig, right? Or
Yeah.
actually, I have an image of a flying pig in mind right now, so maybe
That's
that
the
is
way I
easier
know if
to
you do
imagine.
now.
Even anyway, before we get more absurd metaphors, I think we probably should close it down there. If there are no additional thoughts, in fact, let there be no additional thoughts, I suspect.
No,
No bonus question.
Gents, no, it's fine. We've tried. So
Yeah.
yes, dear listener, this is our take on uh, structural adjustment as a very worthy uh, member of the Scam Hall of Fame. What do you think? Were we right? Are there elements we've missed? Are there aspects that you want to hear more about? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That being said, gentlemen, shall we close it down here?
Yep.
now
Yep.
waiting
Yep.
that be
Fantastic. All
uh,
right.
yes, sir.
Peace.
Yeah.